as chandeliers dripped with golden light, casting reflections over glasses of champagne and sequined gowns. It was one of those nights where wealth performed itself in every corner of the room. Hushed laughter, the clink of crystal, the whisper of satin dresses brushing marble floors. The city's elite had gathered at the annual Everhart Foundation Gala, a night where millions were raised, but even more millions were flaunted. At the center of it all stood Alexander Everhart, the man who owned not just the foundation, but half the skyline outside. His presence was magnetic, dangerous, even tall, sharply dressed, with eyes that could slice through the air like a blade. He had built his empire through deals no one dared question. Yet tonight he played the charming host, a glass of dark wine in his hand and an amused smile fixed to his lips. Around him clustered CEOs, socialites, and heirs who treated this gala less as a charity event and more as a competition for attention. But Alexander's attention was elsewhere, roaming, searching, hunting for amusement in the endless repetition of polite flattery. And it was then that his gaze landed on her. She wasn't meant to be seen. She was one of the invisible ones, the kind of person who slipped in and out of these spaces to clean the mess others left behind. Dressed in a simple black uniform, hair pulled back tightly, she carried herself with the quiet precision of someone used to shrinking into corners. Her name was Elena. Most of the guests would never bother to ask it, but Alexander did notice. He noticed the way she bent to collect a glass carelessly abandoned on a piano's edge, as though her entire body were apologizing for occupying space among them. He noticed her eyes dark, watchful, carrying a depth entirely out of place in a room obsessed with surfaces. And in that moment, Alexander felt the sharp sting of boredom give way to curiosity. "Tell me," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the music and chatter. "Do you play?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a challenge. Heads turned, curiosity ignited like sparks. Elena froze, the empty glass still in her hand. She followed his eyes to the polished black piano standing proudly near the stage, untouched that evening because the hired musicians had taken a break. Her throat tightened. "No, sir. I'm only staff." Laughter rippled across the room, soft, cool, indulgent. Alexander tilted his head, studying her as though she were an uninteresting riddle he might crack open just for sport. "Only staff," he repeated, savoring the words. "Well, if you can play even a single melody worth hearing, I'll marry you myself." Gasps erupted, and laughter, then the gleeful hum of scandal. His tone was mocking, drenched in irony. Everyone knew Alexander Everhart, the most unattainable bachelor in the city, wasn't offering marriage. He was offering humiliation disguised as charm. Elena's cheeks burned. The room spun with whispered comments. She could have bowed her head, apologized, and escaped into invisibility again. That was what everyone expected. That was what Alexander wanted. But instead, something flickered inside her. Perhaps it was anger, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps it was the years of being dismissed, unseen, underestimated. She placed the glass gently on a nearby tray, straightened her spine, and walked toward the piano. The room fell silent. Alexander raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. He leaned back slightly, swirling his wine, as though preparing to watch a circus act. Alana's hands trembled as she pulled out the bench. Memories surged, dusty keys and a childhood church, stolen hours practicing in secret while her mother worked endless shifts, the music that had been both her escape and her betrayal when life forced her away from it. She hadn't touched a piano in years, but her fingers still remembered. She pressed down. One note, then another, then a cascade. The melody spilled into the air like something fragile but defiant, weaving through the silence, wrapping around the listeners until the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't the polished performance of a hired virtuoso. It was raw, aching, alive music that carried sorrow and longing and quiet rebellion. The chandeliers seemed to pulse with it. Even the laughter died. Alexander's glass stilled in his hand. For the first time that evening, his smirk faded. Elena closed her eyes, letting herself vanish into the sound. No longer the cleaning woman, but the girl who had once believed music could lift her out of the shadows. She played not for them, not even for him, but for herself. For every moment she had been told she was nothing, invisible, replaceable. When the final note lingered and dissolved into silence, the room erupted not with ridicule, but with stunned applause. Gasps, cheers, even shouts. People rose to their feet, clapping as though she had shattered the very air they breathed. Elena opened her eyes, and Alexander was still staring. His expression had shifted, unreadable now, as though she had reached into some part of him he had long buried and dragged it out into the open. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Well," he said, his voice quieter now but carrying across the hall. "It seems I underestimated you." The crowd laughed again, but differently, this time nervous, uncertain, unsure of how to interpret the shift in tone. Elena rose from the bench, her pulse still racing. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows before the weight of their stares crushed her. But she also felt something else, something dangerous. A flicker of triumph. She bowed slightly, not to Alexander, but to the music itself, then turned as though to leave. But Alexander stepped forward, blocking her path with effortless authority. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena," she whispered. "Elena," he repeated, tasting it. "I'll remember that." The guests erupted into speculation, their whispers swirling like smoke. Alexander Everhart, the untouchable CEO, had found amusement in a cleaning woman who had just silenced his entire gala. Elena slipped away before anyone could stop her, retreating to the safety of the service corridors. Her hands still trembled, her heart still pounded, but she could not erase the image of his stare-piercing, unsettled, as though she had somehow rewritten the script of the evening without his permission. What she didn't know was that the night had shifted for him, too. For Alexander, power was control, and control was absolute. But something about the way she had dared to rise, dared to surprise, dared to play, that had unsettled him in a way no rival, no deal, no empire ever had. And Alexander Everhart did not like being unsettled. Yet he could not stop thinking about her. The next morning, the newspapers carried headlines about the gala, about the record-breaking donations, about the gowns and the speeches. But buried within the columns of society gossip was a story no one could ignore. The cleaning woman who played the piano. Some mocked it. Some romanticized it. All of them speculated what it meant. Inside his penthouse, Alexander read the words with a faint, dangerous smile. He had built his empire by chasing what no one else saw, by finding value where others saw nothing. Elena was not a deal to be made, but she was something. Something he wanted to understand. And Alexander Everhart always got what he wanted. But Elena, returning to her modest apartment on the city's edge, wanted nothing to do with him. She had tasted humiliation, and though she had turned it into triumph, she knew better than to believe in fairy tales. He had mocked her, and she would not be fooled by his sudden curiosity. Still, when she closed her eyes, she could not silence the memory of his stare, and she hated herself for it. The city worked differently when viewed from Alexander Everhart's tower. From the glass walls of his penthouse, the streets below seemed like veins pulsing with commerce, lights, and restless ambition. He owned half of what those lights touched. Yet as the sun bled into the horizon, spreading red over steel and glass, he found himself staring not at the empire beneath him, but at a single memory, the sound of Elena's music. He hated how it lingered. It had been days since the gala, yet the melody had crawled into the recesses of his mind, refusing to leave. It haunted his board meetings, invaded his solitude, and even dared to follow him in his sleep. He had dealt with rivals who tried to break his control, but never with music, never with a woman whose name he had barely learned. He told himself it was amusement, curiosity, a temporary obsession, the way one might obsess over a rare painting. But the truth was heavier, though he would never admit it, not even to himself. That night, he made a decision. Elena thought she was safe in her small world. She kept her head down at work, scrubbing offices and lobbies that gleamed with a wealth she would never touch. She avoided questions about the gala, though the story had spread like wildfire. Some coworkers teased her, others admired her. But Elena pretended indifference. It had been a mistake, she told herself. She should never have sat at that piano. She should never have let the music escape. Now she carried the burden of being noticed, and she wanted nothing more than to sink back into obscurity. But obscurity was no longer an option. She discovered that the next evening, when she was called into her supervisor's office. "Elena," he said nervously, shuffling papers as though they could shield him from the weight of what he was about to say, "Mr. Everhart has requested you." She froze. "Requested me? For private duty. His penthouse staff. Effective immediately." Her stomach turned. She shook her head. "No, I can't." Her supervisor avoided her eyes. "It's not really optional. He specifically asked for you. You'll be transferred tomorrow." Elena walked out of the office in a haze. The corridors blurred, the sound of mops and vacuums echoing faintly as though from another world. She understood what it meant. Alexander Everhart had decided she was his next amusement. And when men like him decided something, the world rearranged itself to deliver it. The penthouse was nothing like the spaces Elena usually cleaned. It was a cathedral of glass and stone perched above the city, every surface polished to a cold perfection. At its center stood a grand piano, gleaming black like a sentinel reminding her of the night she wanted to forget. She worked quietly, carefully, determined to make herself invisible again. But invisibility was impossible here, not when he was watching. "Do you always clean with such precision?" His voice cut through the silence. Elena stiffened. She hadn't heard him enter. Alexander stood by the window, his reflection stretched across the glass like a shadow. He wasn't dressed for business. No sharp suit, no tie. Instead, he wore a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, but the ease of his clothing only made him more dangerous. "It's my job," she said quietly, refusing to look at him. "Your job?" he repeated, stepping closer. "And yet you play as though you were born to do something else entirely." She kept scrubbing. "You mocked me that night." "I tested you," he corrected, "and you surprised me." Finally, she looked at him. His eyes were unreadable, but there was no mockery now. Only something sharper, heavier, as though he were dissecting her soul with his gaze. "Why am I here?" she asked. "Because I want to know who you are when you're not hiding behind a mop." The words unsettled her more than any insult could. "You think I'm some puzzle for your entertainment, perhaps?" He smiled faintly. But puzzles, when solved, often reveal more than expected. Elena turned away, gripping her cloth tightly. She would not let him see the heat rising in her cheeks, the confusion gnawing at her. "You have all the women in this city at your feet," she said. "Why me?" "Because none of them made me feel what you did when you touched those keys." The confession hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. Elena's chest tightened. She wanted to dismiss it, to laugh at his arrogance. But she remembered the way he had looked at her during the performance, stripped of his smirk, caught off guard. It had been real, if only for a moment. Still, she could not trust him. Not a man like him. "You should leave me alone," she whispered. Alexander stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't leave things alone, Elena. Not when they matter." Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, The city lights outside seemed to blur, the air between them charged with something she could not name. But before it could swallow her, she pulled back, retreating into the safety of distance. "I'm not a game," she said firmly. "Good," he replied. "Games bore me." The days that followed became a battle of wills. Alexander never forced her, never crossed the line, but his presence was constant. He lingered in the penthouse during her shifts, asked questions she refused to answer, left the piano open, as though daring her to touch it again. At night, Elena lay awake, furious at herself for thinking about him. She told herself it was disgust, anger, defiance. But beneath it, something quieter whispered, a memory of his eyes softened by her music, a longing she had buried long ago. She remembered being a girl, dreaming of a life where her talent mattered, where someone saw her. And though she hated herself for it, part of her feared that Alexander Everhart had seen her more clearly in those minutes at the piano than anyone else ever had. But he was still a man who wielded power like a weapon, and she would not be conquered. One evening she entered the penthouse to find the piano bench pulled out, a sheet of music resting on the stand. "Play," Alexander said simply, standing by the window again. "No. Why not?" "Because I'm not your entertainment." He approached slowly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Do you know what happens when people defy me, Elena?" She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "Do you know what happens when people like you believe the world belongs to them?" For a moment, silence stretched between them, sharp and electric. And then, to her shock, Alexander smiled not with cruelty, but with something almost admiring. "You're not afraid of me." "I am," she admitted, "but not in the way you think." That silenced him. For the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes, not dominance, not calculation, but vulnerability. It flickered only for a second before he masked it again, but Elena caught it, and she realized that beneath the empire, beneath the arrogance, there was a man who carried shadows of his own. She didn't know what they were, but she felt them. And against her will, she wanted to understand. Later that night, when she believed him gone, Elena sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered, trembling, before she gave in and let the music flow. The melody was softer this time, a whisper instead of a storm, a confession to the empty room. But when she finished, a quiet voice behind her said, "You play as though your heart is breaking." She turned sharply. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was stripped of all armor. "Tell me, Elena," he said, almost gently, "who broke it?" Her throat tightened. She couldn't answer. Not yet. But for the first time, she wondered if he might understand. And that terrified her more than anything. The nights in the penthouse grew longer, stretching like unspoken conversations. Elena tried to keep her distance, but the piano betrayed her. Each evening she told herself she wouldn't touch it, yet her fingers always found their way back. Music was the one truth she couldn't silence, the one part of her that refused invisibility. And Alexander was always there, listening. He never applauded, never mocked. He simply stood in the shadows, absorbing every note, as though the sound filled something hollow inside him. It unnerved her. It also disarmed her. One evening, as the final note trembled into silence, Alexander spoke without his usual calculation. "My mother played," he said softly. Elena turned, startled. He rarely shared anything personal. She was the only one who could quiet the house. "My father filled it with noise arguments, demands, the sound of ambition, crushing everything in its path. But when she played, it was peace. For a few minutes, it was as though the world didn't own me." Elena searched his face. His expression was calm, but the vulnerability beneath it was undeniable. "Is that why you mocked me?" she asked gently. "Because I reminded you?" His jaw tightened. "I don't mock what reminds me of her." I mock what unsettles me. And I unsettled you? You still do. The air between them thickened. Elena felt her heart beat faster, not with fear this time, but with something she couldn't name. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you asked who I am behind the empire, he said. And I want you to know. The walls she had built around herself began to crack. Elena had spent years convincing herself she didn't need anyone to see her, didn't need recognition or affection. But Alexander was peeling her defenses away, not with force, but with honesty. And it frightened her more than any threat ever could. She tried to remind herself of who he was, a man who wielded power like a blade, who could summon or dismiss her with a single command. Yet when he spoke of his mother, when he looked at her during her playing, he was stripped of that armor. He was simply a man, and she was no longer just staff. Her own past pressed against her chest, demanding to be spoken. She had hidden it for so long, buried it beneath silence, but now it threatened to spill. One night, after finishing a piece, she remained at the bench, staring at the keys. I had a scholarship once, she whispered. Alexander's eyes narrowed, listening. I was accepted into a conservatory. Music was supposed to be my future. But then my mother got sick, and bills don't wait for dreams. I left, took whatever work I could. The piano stayed behind. Her voice trembled. I thought I buried that part of myself, until you forced me to play again. Alexander stepped closer, but his movements were slow, careful, as though he understood how fragile her confession was. You didn't bury it, he said. You protected it. That's why it survived. Elena met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw no distance between them. No empire, no wealth, no divide. Only two people carrying scars they rarely revealed. And she realized with a sudden ache that she wanted him to keep seeing her. But the world outside their fragile truth was not kind. Whispers began to circulate photographs of her leaving the penthouse late at night. Rumors of the CEO's obsession with a cleaning woman. Board members raised questions. Socialites whispered cruel stories. Tabloids spun it into scandal. Elena felt the weight of it pressing down, suffocating. She had worked so hard to remain invisible, and now she was a spectacle. One morning, she confronted him. This has to end, she said firmly. They're tearing me apart out there. Alexander's eyes darkened. Let them talk. I don't care. Well, I do. I can't live under their eyes, Alexander. I don't belong to your world. He stepped forward, voice sharp. And what if I don't belong to it either? She blinked, startled. You think I fit among them? He continued. I wear the mask, yes. I host their galas. I sign their deals. But it's all a cage. The only time I've felt free in years is when you're at that piano. The confession broke her resolve. Tears stung her eyes, not because she doubted him, but because she believed him. Then what are we supposed to do? She whispered. For a long moment, silence stretched. Then Alexander answered with the only truth he had left. We stop pretending. That evening, he made no attempt at restraint. He asked her to play again, but this time, when the music faded, he didn't remain at a distance. He crossed the space between them and reached for her hand. His touch was tentative, almost uncertain, as though he feared she might pull away. But she didn't. Their fingers intertwined, the connection simple yet staggering. Elena felt her breath catch as she looked into his eyes stripped of their sharpness, softened by something she had never expected to see in him, need. And when he leaned closer, when his lips brushed against hers, it wasn't dominance or conquest. It was surrender. Elena's world tilted. She had never imagined herself here, in the arms of a man who owned everything, yet for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt infinite. When they parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. Do you still think you don't belong in my world? he asked. She smiled faintly through her tears. No, I think your world never deserved you. Or me. He laughed softly, the sound raw, unguarded. And maybe it's time we build our own. The weeks that followed were not without struggle. The tabloids screamed, the board threatened, the city buzzed with speculation. But Alexander did not back down. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about appearances, profits, or control. He cared about her. And Elena, though afraid, chose to stand beside him. One night, at a smaller gathering he hosted, Alexander silenced the murmurs with a single announcement. "This is Elena," he said, pulling her hand into his. "She is not staff. She is not a scandal. She is the woman I love." The room fell into stunned silence. Elena's heart pounded as whispers erupted, but she held her head high. She had been humiliated once, mocked in front of them all. Tonight she would not bow. And when Alexander kissed her in front of them, unapologetic and fierce, the whispers could not drown the truth. Later, alone together, Elena sat once more at the piano. This time she didn't play to prove herself, or to defy him, or to survive humiliation. She played because the music had returned to her, not as an escape, but as a beginning. Alexander stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his presence no longer a threat but a promise. "You once said you'd marry me if I could play," she teased softly. He bent down, whispering against her ear, "I wasn't joking." Elena laughed through the tears that gathered in her eyes. "You mocked me. I tested you. And you didn't just pass. Elena, you changed everything." Her fingers pressed the final chord, the sound resonating through the glass walls and into the night sky. And for the first time, both of them believed it was not an ending, but the start of something neither wealth nor power could ever buy, something rare, fragile, and real: love.